The Nur Osmaniye Mosque and the Ottoman Baroque. Capital of the Ottoman Empire for almost 500 years, the city of Istanbul is still defined by the Ottoman landmarks that punctuate its fabric. Chief among these monuments is a series of imperial mosques built by the sultans and other royal patrons after Mehmed II, nicknamed the Conqueror, took the city in 1453, before which it had served as the Byzantine capital of Constantinople. Having already converted the cathedral of Hagia Sophia into a mosque, Mehmed erected an ambitious new mosque complex of his own on one of the city's hills. His successors, most famously Suleiman the Lawgiver or Magnificent, would follow suit, transforming the skyline and cityscape with their foundations, which became bustling social complexes as well as imperial symbols. The last built of Istanbul's hilltop mosque complexes, and arguably the most distinctive, is the mid-18th century Nur Osmaniye, which stands adjacent to the iconic Grand Bazaar on the second hill of the city's main peninsula. Despite its centrality and visibility, the Nur Osmaniye is today not nearly as well known as its older counterparts, having received short shrift from scholars and guidebooks alike. Many tourists simply walk past it on their way into the neighbouring market. The reason for this neglect is, ironically, the very thing that renders the Nur Osmaniye so noteworthy in the first place: its radically different style. Drawing inspiration from the Hagia Sophia, earlier imperial mosques had made use of elaborate vaulting schemes, with multiple semidomes and cupolas cascading down from the central dome. The Nur Osmaniye, by contrast, consists of a single grand dome raised high on four enormous window-filled arches. A more radical break from tradition is the Nur Osmaniye's courtyard, which, uniquely for Ottoman mosque architecture, is semi-elliptical in plan rather than quadrangular. Zooming in, we find the same novelty in the mosque's constituent elements and decoration, all richly carved from limestone and marble. Absent here are the pointed arches, geometricized arabesque scrolls, and angular muqarnas or stalactite work that are hallmarks of traditional Ottoman design and Islamic art more generally. In their place are round and curvilinear arches, acanthus leaves, scrolls shaped as the letters C and S, dental mouldings, and scallop shells. The mosque's various dependencies, which include drinking fountains, a medrese or college, a public soup kitchen, and a tomb, all feature the same fresh manner. What we are seeing exemplified by the Nur Osmaniye is the kind of architecture that transformed Istanbul between 1740 and the early 1800s. Its ornamental vocabulary is an idiosyncratic but recognizable adaptation of Western European and especially Italian models, and it is for this reason that 20th century art historians dubbed the style Turkish Baroque or Ottoman Baroque. Itself a controversial and contested term, the word Baroque remains widely employed in art history to describe a continuum of related architectural traditions that flourished in the 17th and 18th centuries and were characterized by their spirited, often showy, and sometimes uncanonical use of forms derived from Greco-Roman classicism, and I'm including here the 18th century offshoot of the style known as Rococo. After spreading out from its original home of Italy and achieving dominance in Europe, the Baroque went global, whether through colonial transplantation or conscious adoption, with variants in such far-flung locations as Mexico City, St. Petersburg, and Beijing. It should not surprise us then that the Ottomans too participated in the Baroque, yet this participation has given rise to considerable unease. The scholars who first spoke of a Turkish or Ottoman Baroque usually treated it as a clumsy emulation born at a time of territorial and political decline for the Ottoman Empire. According to this narrative, the Ottomans, now long past their 16th century heyday, turned to Western models in a desperate bid to save their ailing empire, copying foreign styles of which they had very little real understanding. Encapsulating this viewpoint are the words of the historian Bernard Lewis, who, speaking of the Nur Osmaniye, has argued, quote, When a foreign influence appears in something as central to a culture as an imperial foundation and a cathedral mosque, there is clearly some faltering of cultural self-confidence." Unquote. More recent studies have rightly moved away from such negative assessments and demonstrated the continued vigour and significance of 18th century Ottoman architecture, whose capacity for stylistic renewal should be understood as a sign of vitality rather than atrophy. These scholarly correctives have tended to reject the term Ottoman Baroque as an unwelcome Eurocentric imposition, but in my own work, I have found it helpful to reclaim the label as a means of signalling what I believe the Ottomans themselves were aiming for with this new building style, which was to take part, deliberately and on their own terms, in a globally resonant aesthetic of power and magnificence. Whether we call this global aesthetic Baroque or not is another question, but as long as the term remains in use, the Ottoman version of it must be counted as part of the broader phenomenon. To understand the rise of the Ottoman Baroque, we must first rewind a little to the year 1703, when the newly enthroned Sultan Ahmed III returned the Ottoman court to Istanbul following extended periods of absence in the empire's second city, Edirne. Istanbul's reinvigoration as capital precipitated a building boom characterized by taste for novelty and greater receptiveness to foreign styles. For the first third of the century, motifs inspired by Iranian, Western, and perhaps Mughal models were woven into a largely traditional Ottoman decorative repertoire and applied to buildings that, while smaller than the monuments of the past, stood out for their ornamental richness and eclecticism. An expanding base of well-to-do citizens partook as patrons in this diversified aesthetic landscape, but the Sultan and the elite retained their spot at the top, making a show of the court's presence by leading the regeneration of the capital. This initial wave of architectural novelty, which scholars have associated with the term tulip era, gave way in about 1740 to a more striking kind of rebranding that engaged more specifically with European models, the Ottoman Baroque. The new style burst onto the scene and announced a dramatic shift in Ottoman visual culture, swiftly replacing centuries-old motifs with a fresh, eye-catching idiom that was soon taken up in media other than architecture and in regions outside Istanbul. The initial batch of Ottoman Baroque works tended to be of smaller scale, a testament to their experimental nature, but with the Nur Osmaniye Mosque, built between 1748 and 1755, the style established itself on a truly monumental scale. What had happened to bring about this rather sudden and comprehensive shift? In 1739, after several years of war with the Russians and the Austrian Habsburgs, the armies of Ahmed III's successor, Mahmud I, enjoyed a decisive victory in Belgrade, Serbia, a territory that the Ottomans had lost 2 decades earlier to the Habsburgs. The ensuing peace treaties not only returned Serbia to Ottoman rule, but they also brought about 30 years of peace between the Ottoman Empire and its Christian rivals. Contrary to the narrative of unremitting decline then, the Ottoman Baroque was a style born at a favourable moment for the empire, launched on the back of a successfully concluded war. We are dealing, I argue, with a state-sponsored endeavour that sought to reassert the Ottoman Empire's world standing using a cross-culturally legible and prestigious mode of architecture. In this light, the reference to European models takes on a pointed rather than defeatist meaning. After all, the Baroque was associated with the very enemies over whom the Ottomans had prevailed, including in Belgrade itself, where the Habsburgs had built a number of structures in the style. The Baroque was, moreover, already well known to elite Ottomans from their collections of imported European books, prints, and luxury objects. Its utilization in architecture was therefore far from unthinking or aimless. The deliberate and triumphal meaning of the Ottoman Baroque is made explicit by the Nur Osmaniye, for tradition held that only sultans who had won in wars were entitled to build grand mosques in the empire's capital. This unwritten rule had resulted in a long hiatus in the construction of sultans' mosques. The last to be built before the Nur Osmaniye was the early 17th century Sultan Ahmed Mosque, which itself proved controversial owing to the military shortcomings of its founder Ahmed I. Mahmud I, on the other hand, had every right to erect a mosque because of his army's success at Belgrade, and indeed, the French consul and long-time Ottoman resident, Claude Charles de Peyssonel, tells us in his writings that the Nur Osmaniye was founded precisely to celebrate this victory. Peyssonel also comments approvingly of the mosque's appearance, which he dubs, quote, a monstrous mixture of the European and Turkish style, though still magnificent and elegant, monstrous here meaning hybrid rather than ugly. As this description suggests, Peyssonel viewed the style as combining foreign and local elements, and it is important to underscore that the Ottoman Baroque was as Ottoman as it was Baroque. Earlier, we saw the contrasts between the Nur Osmaniye and its precursors, but no less important are the continuities. The dome, for example, is typically Ottoman in its relationship to the space below, tightly capping the prayer hall instead of being raised on a drum as it would be in other traditions. Likewise rooted in local practice are the two pencil-shaped minarets, whose lead-sheathed caps were replaced with stone in 1890. Even the mosque's sculpted doorways, despite their dazzlingly novel ornament, ultimately conform to earlier examples in their overall shape. And notice too the copious use of calligraphy, an art that lost none of its importance with the Ottoman Baroque. However much the mosque differs from what came before then, it remains an unmistakably Ottoman product, and even its most European-inspired elements have been adapted rather than copied verbatim. Take, for example, the column capitals, which evoke their Western counterparts without imitating them. Such localization was facilitated by the fact that the Ottomans, through their Byzantine inheritance, were heirs to the same Greco-Roman tradition from which the Baroque itself derived, and indeed, a number of Byzantine references are skillfully woven into the Nur Osmaniye and other Ottoman Baroque buildings. Interestingly, in view of this Byzantine connection, the Nur Osmaniye's architect was a Greek Istanbulite named Simeon Kalfa, the first non-Muslim architect to be credited with an Ottoman imperial mosque. His appointment underscores a notable development in Ottoman architectural practice during the 18th century, whereby builders and artists from Istanbul's Greek and Armenian communities grew increasingly prominent. A key reason for this trend appears to have been the facility with which non-Muslim Ottomans could work in the new style, a facility based on their unrivaled access to European models through long-established mercantile and educational networks. There is evidence that Istanbul's Greeks and Armenians were already using the Ottoman Baroque in their own visual culture as a marker of their Christian identity several years before the style was adopted by the state and given new, more public meaning. Peyssonel was not the only commentator to appreciate the result. The new manner found favour with observers both Ottoman and foreign, with several writers of the 18th and early 19th centuries deeming the Nur Osmaniye Istanbul's finest mosque. Such was the buzz surrounding this monument that its construction history was narrativized by a certain Ahmed Effendi, who had served as the project's financial secretary, and who wrote of the mosque, quote, "It is fair and accurate to say that this beautiful building and gladdening house of worship, all of solid marble and so charming, has no like or counterpart not only in the capital Istanbul, but indeed in all the lands of Islam." Unquote. Ahmed Effendi's account of the mosque's creation culminates in a detailed description of the splendid ceremony held upon its opening, when the Sultan arrived as part of a multitudinous cavalcade and oversaw the granting of gifts and robes of honour. Much of the ceremony involved an L-shaped royal pavilion attached to the prayer hall, a theatrical structure whose semi-transparent ramp and gallery helped to showcase the Sultan's entry into his private prayer space within the mosque proper. The Sultan in question was not Mahmud I, who had died a year before the project's completion, but his brother Osman III, who named the mosque in dual reference to himself and the dynasty. Nur Osmaniye can be interpreted as either Light of Osman or Light of the Ottomans. With the Nur Osmaniye's establishment, the practice of building imperial mosques in Istanbul was revived, and a series of new foundations sprang up during the following 130 years. No longer occasioned by martial victories, these mosques tended to be smaller in scale and located beyond the city's walled core, expanding the royal image as Istanbul itself grew. But it was not only by bringing the imperial mosque back to life that the Nur Osmaniye left an impact. As a building that put the Ottoman Baroque definitively on the map, the Nur Osmaniye also set the cosmopolitan tone that would define the Ottoman Empire's visual culture for the rest of its history. The 19th and early 20th centuries witnessed the introduction of localized forms of neoclassicism, eclecticism, and Art Nouveau, styles that, like the Baroque before them, asserted the Ottoman Empire's continued relevance within the international political and cultural landscape. If modern observers have tended to dismiss such architecture as foreign, decadent, and westernized, we should recall that contemporary viewers felt very differently, admiring the material's cross-cultural qualities without questioning its Ottomanness. The Nur Osmaniye Mosque stands today as vivid proof of the power of such synthesis. Be sure to visit it if you ever find yourselves in Istanbul.